leaders from both sides exchanged congratulations on their 70th anniversary of diplomatic ties. China and DPRK ties are of great significance not only to regional security, but also to that of the world. So, how has this relationship evolved since the Korean War? Where does it stand today? And what's the way forward to a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula? Before our discussion, take a look at what's happened over the past 7 decades.
The most recent meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and DPRK leader Kim Jong-un took place this June. Welcomed by Kim at the Pyongyang Sunan International Airport, President Xi kicked off his state visit by reviewing an honor guard. As the first visit to the state by a top Chinese leader in 14 years, President Xi said he came with good wishes of carrying forward the two countries' friendship and writing a new chapter in bilateral relations. The meeting between the two leaders addressed various issues and aimed at diversified cooperation. But a more important issue is regional peace and stability. Calling for new development of relations between China and the DPRK, this is the 5th time leaders from the two countries have met since early 2018. Kim Jong-un's first visit to China came in March 2018, when both sides agreed to build on the friendship between the DPRK and China and to deepen their exchanges in the future. Less than 2 months later, Kim visited China again in May, this time in the beautiful seaside city of Dalian, in China's northeastern Liaoning province. President Xi said China supports the DPRK's 100,000 Chinese volunteers died to defend the DPRK's national security and help Pyongyang driving American forces back. Following the war's end in 1953, Beijing provided extensive economic support to Pyongyang. In 2009, a year of friendship to mark 60 years of diplomatic relations was declared. President Xi Jinping has put much emphasis on the ties with the DPRK, describing the relationship as a treasure created by generations of leaders, a bond that will only grow stronger.
For more on the China-DPRK ties, we are joined by two panelists in Washington, D.C., Jenny Tang, research analyst of the Stimson Center and managing editor of 38 North. In Beijing, Zhao Tong, senior fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Welcome to both of you. I want to start with you, Mr. Zhao. 5 times meeting of leaders from China and DPRK over 1 year's time. That's quite something. What do you make of the nature of these exchanges?
Well, firstly, apparently the two countries have some very important common grounds in improving bilateral relations. They share similar political values. Both countries emphasize their socialist ideology, their common perspective on regional security issues, and also they share important strategic interests in the region. In the future, it's highly important. Effective cooperation between two countries can help pave the ground for more progress on the denuclearization negotiation. That can help create a more stable and peaceful regional environment, which is critical for economic development for both countries.
I see. However, on the other hand, if you look at the congratulation letters both sides sent to each other, Ms. Tao, the words being used to describe this relationship are different. For example, from the Chinese side, it is more emphasis on a new historical stage. It is also an emphasis on so-called healthy and long-term. Well, from the DPRK side, it is about so-called unwavering emphasis on the traditional friendship. So you see, words are being used differently from both sides. How would you understand the differences?
Well, I think it's more about the utility of the relationship itself. I think historically, while they have had close ties, there's also been tensions there. And I think the Chinese are emphasizing that they want to help North Korea come into a new era, help them be more accepted by the international community, help encourage the process to keep them going on the track that they have been going over the past 2 years now. Whereas I think the North Koreans, this is very typical of to emphasize the relationship that they have had and the ties that they have had. and why that creates a solid foundation to continue that relationship forward.
Let's talk about some specifics. Trade, for example, increased about 15%. Of course, last year the trade was rather low as a result of sanctions. Mr. Zhao, is this going to be one of the pillars between the two sides?
Well, it has always been a very important pillar of the bilateral relationship. China is North Korea's most important trading partner by far compared with other countries. And I think that's a mutually beneficial trading relationship. For China, if denuclearization can be achieved and North Korea can be incorporated into a regional economic development zone, that would benefit both countries and also help revitalize the local economies in northeast China. And for North Korea, I think it is also important to get the experience of China in developing economy, opening up to the international economic system. So there's many lessons that North Korea can take from the Chinese experience.
Ms. Tao, given the many speeches given by the DPRK leader over the past few years, particularly recently, what do you make of the desire to develop its economy and also to learn from the China case study?
Well, I do think Kim Jong-un is really focused on economic development. You have seen a number of moves where he's tried to move the party ahead of the military, try and redirect resources, especially after he declared the ending of the Byungjin policy of dual development of a nuclear and economic development, and trying to really focus on economic development. And I think, you know, he is trying to build an identity on prosperity and sort of forward-looking prosperity for North Korea. I do think, though, that he is looking at China as sort of a mentorship of how do you create economic growth, but still have a pretty strong sense of social control. And I think not only China, but some of the other countries like Vietnam as well, is how do you maintain the power of the state while still allowing some level of socioeconomic development and wealth generation for the people. And I think that's a huge struggle that he's going to have to deal with in the next few years.
I see. Mr. Zhao, one of the fascinating things is about the China-DPRK relationship. It's about the fact that the two always found each other at critical junctures. And some would argue this is also another critical juncture. If you look at the DPRK-US negotiation, if you also look at China-US relationship, of course, it's not necessarily linked to what the China-DPRK relationship is. But how do you look at that historical juncture issue, this time maybe also reflected?
I agree. I think it is a historical juncture for China-U.S. relationship. It is also a historical juncture for China-DPRK, for DPRK-U.S. relationship. Both countries are under, maximum pressure from the United States in some sense.
The so-called maximum pressure practice from the U.S.
Strategy from the United States that is applied to both countries. I think that in some sense drive the two countries closer together. They both feel they are unfairly treated by the West, especially the United States. They are being discriminated against. So similar, like the same pressure from the United States is driving China and Russia together. I think it is also making China and North Korea forging a closer tie. But more importantly, I think there is a need for the two countries to cooperate on the current denuclearization negotiation, because both countries feel that some rebalance of regional security structure needs to be made.
I see.
The current lack of security guarantee to North Korea needs to be addressed. So by cooperating together, they hopefully can breathe new air into the forming of a new security structure and a new peace regime in Northeast Asia.
Right. Ms. Tao, before we go to the next part of our discussion about the trilateral relationship or beyond, I also want to ask you about that. How much the so-called maximum pressure strategy coming from the current administration in Washington work really on the issue of DPRK denuclearization, on the issue of China-U.S. relations, and how is that rallying the other parties together toward Washington, Ms. Tao? Your analysis.
Well, I think the whole sanctions regime against North Korea has been effective in building up the cost of North Korea to continue down this path, but has not been convincing of changing their behavior and changing their strategic thinking about how the nuclear weapons program fits into their strategic interests. Certainly when the U.S. and China were cooperating on sanctions implementation, and China was stricter about that implementation and willing to do more on that implementation, it did impose greater costs on North Korea as to the actions that they were taking. Since North Korea has been in the diplomatic process and to help encourage the diplomatic process, a lot of that implementation, I think we're seeing ease on the edges, of course, even though the sanctions themselves have not been lifted. And I think that appetite to go back to the type of implementation that we saw in 2017 that was sparked by North Korea's continual testing of both nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, it just isn't there anymore, as long as they refrain from that level of provocative behavior. And so unless we have that cooperation, the impact of sanctions on North Korea tends to dwindle. And North Korea has been very good at adapting to the situation as well.
All right.
So
we're going to,
of course,
continue our discussion about this topic later in the later half of our discussion. Jenny Tao, Zhao Tong, stay with us, and we'll be back after this. For more on the DPRK nuclear issue, as we promised earlier in the program, we are once again joined by Jenny Tao and also Zhao Tong in Beijing and Washington. Meanwhile, we're also joined in Los Angeles. Jonathan Pollack, non-resident senior fellow of the Center for East Asia Policy Studies and John Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Pollack, welcome to our program. I want you to come in to our discussion first. You've been listening to your two colleagues when they were talking about the bilateral relations between China and the DPRK. Now, the Stockholm discussion wrapped up without anything. Some wonder whether DPRK is in any hurry to reach any conclusion with the United States and vice versa. What is your assessment?
I think that the evidence is compelling. Number one, that very little other than having a meeting was achieved in Stockholm. So far as I'm aware, North Korea came with no proposals of its own. Its intent seemingly was to say, what is the United States prepared to put on the table? The United States evidently did present some possibilities. North Korea, as I anticipated, deemed them utterly unsatisfactory, so they went home. And it may be that there will be other dragged out sessions of these lower level talks, but it's a very, very disheartening message for anyone who wants to think that we are making any kind of discernible progress toward the goal of denuclearization.
I see. Let's talk about, what might be the logic behind both sides. Mr. Zhao, now, for Pyongyang, why is there a hurry at this moment for them to reach any conclusion with the U.S., given the fact that Washington is not in consensus at all, particularly now, if you look at the impeachment and everything related to it, and also the fact that there are a lot of divisions among other 5 members of the earlier 6-party talks. So obviously, Pyongyang seemed to already smell the differences much more than it used to be.
Yes, as you mentioned, I think from the Pyongyang's perspective, it might be a golden time for them to be on the offense. Right now, President Trump is under siege domestically due to the impeachment campaign against him. And Pyongyang might believe that due to a weakened U.S. President, Trump would be more willing to offer more concessions. Pyongyang has been able to forge good relations with other big powers in the region. It also has accommodating government in South Korea. So all those may be viewed as favorable environment for North Korea to ask more at this moment.
This town, step by step, parallel tracks, those were argued as the best practices. But of course, things have changed so dramatically as we speak about the regional situation and also world situation when it comes to security, nuclear security. So here's the thing, is Washington's offer this time enough for Pyongyang? Who is becoming more impatient, more eager to reach a deal now?
Well, I don't think the North Koreans are necessarily eager to reach a deal that isn't good on their terms, right? Neither side wants to make a deal that isn't good on their terms. I think this end of the year deadline has more to do with American election cycles than it does an urgency for Kim to show something. Because if you get a deal by the end of the year and have a year to try and implement and make some progress, it might be sustainable through a potential political transition, but if you're still negotiating in that last year, then certainly whatever you get at the end of the year, if Trump doesn't win, then suddenly it could be overturned, as we've seen with other types of arrangements before. But I think, the North Koreans in this time around, the Americans keep wanting to get back to this working level negotiation process, this more traditional negotiation process. And I just don't think that the North Koreans think that's an effective approach. Yeah. They seem to come and they've made their statement that they're willing to give up Yongbyon. They're not willing to give up more. They're not really willing to negotiate on that point. And they keep waiting for the U.S. to come up proposals for Yongbyon. And I think they've been messaging, this public messaging, to try and get the U.S. to come up with the right proposal without having to do these long, dragged-out talks. Similar to what they've been doing in South Korea that President Moon was willing to go along with, but that's very difficult for the U.S. to justify doing.
Mr. Polak, as we talked many times over the past few months, things are changing so fast, sometimes in a speed that we wouldn't even believe it. Therefore, Mr. Polak, some of the so-called traditional security threats, such as the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, now some believe have been sidetracked by some of the dramas created recently by politicians. So, Mr. Polak, do you see at all this will be once again back on the agenda as the priority?
Well, I think let's set aside the impeachment process for now. I don't think that really helps us understand what is going on right now. Essentially, President Trump entered into relations at a very high level with Kim Jong-un, made extravagant claims about what this suggested, claimed even that the North Korean nuclear issue had been solved after Singapore. Clearly nothing of the sort was true. And frankly, President Trump has been content as long as North Korea does not undertake any additional nuclear weapons tests or any long-range missile tests. Everything else is permitted. The sanctions regime, as was noted earlier, has begun to erode, I think, significantly. North Korea finds other ways around it. It's a very unhealthy process right now. And, again, I think what North Korea is banking on is they will have a fourth meeting with President Trump, believing somehow that the president and the president alone is willing to make enormous concessions to North Korea that others are not. That's where things stand. Trump needs this in the context of his own
Interesting, Mr. Polak, when you said that, when you say particularly the president wants it, probably needs it more urgently, when would that be? Under what circumstances is that need will be more urgent than any previous time? Would you like to give us some hints about the timing and possibilities?
Well, I think it is very much tied to the fact that impeachment process or no impeachment process, President Trump is under real political pressure. Maybe you could say the maximum pressure is now directed more against him than it is against North Korea. Trump believes that his seeming breakthrough with North Korea, things that no other president has ever remotely considered, is one of his singular accomplishments. So he's very invested at a psychological and a political level of all of this. But what we're really seeing is just how problematic these overtures and gestures were. It doesn't change the realities of North Korea's continuing to pursue weapons enhancement of all kinds, ones that very frankly pose a very direct threat to Japan and to South Korea.
DPRK is a de facto nuclear state. That fact has to be bared in the minds of many once we talk about the topic related to it. Mr. Zhao, now, given the political environment, whether it is in one country or regionally or worldwide as it is today, is the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue likely to be the priority for governments, or are we already being pushed to the side?
Well, in the United States, I think there are two possibilities. One has been suggested by Professor Pollack, that Trump might be more willing to have another summit meeting with Kim due to his domestic problems. But the other possibility is, given time, due to the impeachment development, Trump might be distracted. In recent interviews, when he was posed questions about DPRK, he didn't really talk much on the topic and quickly diverted the topic to domestic issues. So clearly, North Korea is not very much on his mind. So if time goes on and domestic troubles boil, I'm afraid Trump might be less interested in committing major resources and attention to the denuclearization negotiation. For North Korea, it is unilaterally trying to create this sense of urgency by conducting new missile tests, most recently the launch of a submarine-launched ballistic missile, putting the pressure on the United States and signaling that if you do not come to me with better concessions, I can make more progress. So it's I think, an asymmetrical situation in which North Korea is driving the situation to a more urgent point.
But whether countries, governments, and politicians are ready to handle the crisis, if there are any to come, that's a big question mark. But for now, I want to thank the three of you helping us to understand the latest situation, and things are changing so fast. Thank you once again, Jonathan Pollack, Zhao Tong, last but not least, Jenny Tao. Really appreciate it.